Hello everybody and welcome back to another stream by me, Blute084 Art and Games. And we're in for another day of Inktober of 2022. If you're new, I'll give you a little explanation of what Inktober is. Inktober is where you take yourself a prompt off the prompt list that the organizer of Inktober has gives it out about a week or so beforehand, so you don't have too much time to prepare, because the idea is that you take the prompt of each day and then you do an illustration based on that prompt word. And each day is different. It doesn't follow into a path of something that so you've got I think this time we had, or yesterday in fact, we had bogey. Today we have a different word. But the day before that was bad dog, and the day before that was heist. It was heist and then bad dog before that. Yeah, we've got different words each day, and you have to kind of like either use your imagination. You can use prompts. You can use references for your prompts. I generally get a few references coming into stream. Get myself ready, unless the word is like giving me an instant thing to think, do you know what? I've never drawn that before. I'm going to try and draw that. So that is generally the idea. You'll take your piece of paper, if you're working with paper, and you get yourself an ink pen. You can use the vast amount of things to ink with. That can go from using paint brushes or ink brushes. Then you can generally, I would just use a pen. You can use any kind of pen. I generally just use a gel roll ball pen and fine line. What I would fine line everything with, if I were doing a sketch and then inking over the top of it. You can use brush pens, you can use Copic markers. It doesn't matter what it is as long as it's ink. The idea is you don't put a sketch down first, so you just do everything freehand. It is a kind of test of sorts to see what your abilities are as a freehand artist. And to sort of test yourself. It's not a full-on competition. There are no prizes. It's just out there for the art community. I've just noticed that's got a little smile. Out there for the artist community to have a go, join the community, have fun with each other, pick off either ideas of other people, chat to each other about your artworks that you've done, and obviously just like have a nice time with the community of Inktober. Like I said, I've joined in about 4 years in a row now, and I love it every year because I could never like pick something out of the hat and go, oh, do you know, I'm just going to do that. One year I actually did a full comic of each word and tried to make a scene for the comic each time. And I think the year before I'd never done ink freehanding before, and I was like, do you know, I'm just gonna see what I can do. If it's crap, it's crap, you know. And one year I just did a 5-minute sketch, and with an ink pen, just to see how quickly I could do something. It is completely up to you what you do with it, and you can use any kind of like techniques that you have out there that works for you. The idea is you don't put a sketch down, you just freehand everything. As we're getting onto that, I am going to be freehanding an ink drawing today, but the different change that I've decided to take is I've moved away from paper and pens, and I've gone to a digital medium. I am still only using the ink tools that I get given by the program itself, and I am going to be using a freehand tool, not a screen, to be drawing on. And now I tried 1 year. I tried doing it. Not 1 year, but tried doing some inking with my mouse. I just never had any good time with it. Since I've gotten this, I really want to learn how to freehand doing some digital work, because I'm fairly good when it comes around to doing some sketching and ink over it. But with this, I can just go straight to the ink, and then I can add the colour straight away afterwards. I don't have to sketch if I don't want to. I mean, I can sketch and then use that sketch as a thing and refine the sketch over and over again. I don't have to faff around, and that's what I like about the digital medium, that you've got the freedom of things that you wouldn't necessarily have with the traditional artwork, and that's why I wanted to see what my freehanding ability was. Because a lot of the time I'll sketch something down on a piece of paper, bring it into the program and use that as my guidelines to sketch. Unless I've already inked it and I've already refined it, then I will just completely copy over the thing like a trace and then add the colour in appropriately. And yeah, I've tried to, I definitely have not done that once this time in this thing, because I will use a reference, but I will not use a complete resketch of something else that I've already drawn, because that's not part of the challenge for me. I want to do complete freehand. Yeah, again, it may not come straight out of my mind, but I will use only, eye to see, eye to do the sketch. But without further ado, guys, let's tell you what the sketch word, or sorry, no, the ink word today is. I'm going to burp because I've just had my tea. A real garlic on that one. You wish you wouldn't have smell. I wish you had smell-o-vision, eh? Garlic. But yeah, the word for today is fairy for day 24 of Inktober 2022. Yeah, that's the word. I'm going to jump into my program that I'm going to be using. I am going to be doing this all live, so if you're watching live, you're more than welcome to leave some comments. You can either tell me where to look for your stuff, or you can come over to my Instagram, because I'd love to see your artworks and see what else you did for today's word. If you are now just finding out about it and you want to still join in, you're more than welcome to do so. So you can do start 24 and then work until the end of the month, because there is 31 days of this month. But yeah, the word is fairy, and I didn't want to go with the general boring old look at that cute fairy this time, because I've drawn so many fairies. I don't want to do another fairy. So I'm going a little bit darker this year. As it is October, I thought I'd go a little bit darker with my illustration. You'll find out hopefully what it is as I start drawing it. I am not going to give you too many hints. I'm going to see if you guys can guess what it is before I get to the point where I kind of have to tell you what it is. But yeah, we're doing a fairy, but it's just not it's not the normal type that you would know. But this is the app, or the application, or the program that I'm using. It is called Krita, Krita, and it is the best thing you can get for yourself if you are training yourself to do digital artwork, because it has all the tools that Photoshop and all the other things out there have, but it's completely free. That is right, guys, it is completely free. You do not have to pay for a thing when it comes to this. You don't even need to pay for extra brushes, because every now and then they'll update the pack and you can get extra brushes. You can obviously buy your own pack of brushes and bring them into Krita, because Krita does support a lot of different things, or different people so you can purchase pens from. You can bring them in for yourself to have them here. I've never needed to, because I've always got the tools that I need. I'm probably sure I'll bring some brushes in at some point, but I just have not found anything wrong with this Krita to do what I want to do with. As I'm still training, there's no point me going out and getting the best of best stuff. I'm just doodling a lot of the time, just sort of making pieces of artwork for people to have, because I have got myself an Etsy and I take a few commissions here and there, and I'll make foam backgrounds, things to print out as a poster, or you can have them printed onto t-shirts, mugs, or bags, pretty much anything you can think of. Or you can have them, if you really want them, put into a vinyl, so you can wrap something up in with it. So I could wrap your table or wrap your PC. Something you can have it. Stickers, anything, literally anything you can think of, I can get printed out for you. You just got to ask me for what you want. Specifics, very, very handy. If you do tell me the specifics, especially if you've got a phone and you just want a digital background for your phone, you've got to tell me what phone you have so I can get it so it fits. Otherwise, you get problems with it not fitting and it just being not good for you. But otherwise, this is Krita. This does everything you'll ever need. It comes with brushes. It is very handy if you have yourself a drawing tablet. But again, you do not need a drawing tablet. You can go to the website. You can download it for yourself. and you can start the day it downloaded. You don't have to worry about any kind of learning curve. The learning curve is literally turn it on, see what that does, oh that's what that does, sorted. There's no massive learning curve to like figure everything out, and any of the harder stuff you can find something on YouTube and they will explain everything for you, and it'll take you about 15 minutes to get up into what you want to do with it. You've got your layers over here like you normally do, and you've got your paintbrushes and your pen brushes all down here, and it's all got loads of different brusher packs. Like I've got our brusher packs here, that's my digital ones, and I've got my inking ones, which I don't generally use because I prefer the ones I use. You got your painting tools, and then you got your sketching pencil tools, and then obviously my favourite, which I like to use, got my brush pen, my fountain pen if I want a thinner line, and then I've got my not a paintbrush, my ink brush, which is an ink brush, and it does put down in that sort of same style. It's not so much the saturation like bloppy, like wet. It doesn't look wet, which is kind of good. I don't want the wet. I want the grey of it, and it's really good. It's one of those things that came free, which you can't go wrong with free. Without further ado, guys, I am going to be listening to a little story today, and then I might move into some music, depending on if I can find another story or not. But otherwise, hopefully you will enjoy today's stream. Again, if you're watching live, you can leave some comments, and if you are new, please watch all the way to the end, because one, you get to see an awesome artwork, you get to listen to some awesome music, and you also get to hang about with me, which is, I do really appreciate. So hang about, guys, and stick about. Even if you are watching and you can't watch the whole thing, come back and see how I did, because the stream will be available as videos for your pleasure whenever you got a chance to watch them. But so like I said, without further ado, I'm going to get that story going. It may be a little bit not for children, so be prepared. It might be a bit of a spooky story, because again, I'm not doing a normal fairy, I'm doing it a little bit darker this year. So let's get on with it, and I will turn the mic off, and I'll turn it down, turn it down, whatever, at certain points during the stream, so I can chat to you, carry on. But obviously I need to concentrate, so I don't waffle on all the way. This isn't a how-to video. This is just me doing the entry for today. So yeah, let's get that going, and I'll start a drawing.
There were a few things that stood out to me about the book. Maybe it was the way it arrived, outside our little second-hand store, wrapped in a ribbon, bone dry on the wet pavement. Maybe it was the way its cover and pages were so aged, yellowed, and peeling, but the stories it contained were so new. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something in the stories themselves, some secrets that they seemed to unlock in me and the world around me, as if just by reading them, I was breathing some hidden and terrifying reality into existence. I suppose, in a way I was, which is why I've chosen to share them with you. Number 1. Teeth Fairies. Kelly was 5 when she lost her first tooth. This meant she was the first in her class and had never heard of anyone losing their teeth before. She'd kept it quiet, nudging it loose in her gum with her tongue on the long drives to and from school, before finally prizing it free with her stubby fingers. She had never heard of the tooth fairy, or should I say, teeth fairies. It wasn't like she was trying to make them upset, but with no knowledge of what she was meant to do, and a fear that she'd done something wrong. A fear, may I add, that ran so deep it went through her stomach and through her toes and into the earth beneath her. She decided to hide the tooth. She didn't tell anyone where she'd hidden it. And even I, dear reader, am unsure as to the exact location of her first tooth, or, in fact, the location of her subsequent teeth. What I do know is that even when her parents found out, and she learned about the tooth fairy and the money that was offered in exchange for the white pearls of her milk teeth, she kept hiding them. Perhaps she was planting them like seeds, digging holes in the wet mud with her bare hands. Perhaps she was dropping them into ponds and puddles in the woods, watching them slowly sink while holding her breath. Perhaps she was simply swallowing them. She would sometimes sneak out at night, staining her pajama bottoms with mud, and her parents would wake her to find her sheets damp and clumps of soil under her fingernails. This may, of course, have been unrelated entirely. It's a big world out there, after all, and Kelly felt obligated to explore it. Her parents let it all happen. The professionals they consulted said it was only natural, and used words like independence and autonomy, and said she'd grow out of it. When Kelly lost her last tooth, she hid it as she'd done the others, and came downstairs the next morning, plunking herself down at the kitchen table with a gravity unlike someone her age, and simply stated, "Finished." Kelly would forget she'd done any of this by the time she was 16, and wouldn't have cared much if her mother told her. By the time she was 21, it was more than a distant memory, and if she was ever asked about her milk teeth, which was unlikely, she would assume that her parents had thrown them away or sorted them out one way or another. Kelly was now 21 and living in London. She worked for a small marketing firm and was earning enough to keep her head above water. She had friends that she loved, a cat she shared with her flatmates, and a tattoo of a cactus on her thigh. She was happy. But she was aware, keenly aware, that she could be happier. She had a boyfriend once when she was 18 for a day and a half, until he told her that he was actually in love with her best friend, who was secretly gay, and the whole thing had collapsed in on itself like a limp star. She had not had a boyfriend since. One morning, after drinking too much cheap wine that cost far too little, cradling her head in her hands like it was going to split open and mouthing the words painkillers to her friends like it was a foreign language, she decided she wanted a boyfriend again. Her flatmates were excited by the prospect and spent the week in fits of conspiratorial giggles, sharing photos on their phones Kelly wasn't allowed to see of men who were either too short or too weird, or who were known to bring large books along to the dates as if it wasn't obvious that they were desperately trying to compensate for something. But after a week, she had 3 dates lined up. Date number 1. Andrew was nice, if a little boring, but he was funny, and Kelly found herself laughing more and more as the evening went on. Maybe he was the one. But she didn't like how he kept covering his mouth when he chewed, and when he laughed, and even when he spoke. And it was then that she realized that she couldn't see his teeth. This began to bother her as dinner progressed, and towards the end of the main and the second glass of wine, the thought crept up on her, snaking its way up her spine and through the back of her skull. She needed to see his teeth. This thought came to her as if broadcast from somewhere else, but it planted itself right in the center of her mind and refused to leave. And so she talked about her own teeth and exposed them and waited for him to do the same. When she finally saw them, she wished that she hadn't, and she tasted her dinner a second time at the back of her throat, the potatoes and chicken now wet with bile. His mouth was filled with more teeth than she thought was humanly possible, let alone plausible. His teeth were crammed together like enamel sardines, all jostling for space, and she realized that there were hundreds of them, not only lining the ridge of his gums, but sprouting from other places inside his mouth like strange mushrooms, and that in fact, in that moment, she couldn't see the back. But it was as if they continued on endlessly into the darkness of his throat, tiny milk teeth, glossy and gleaming. She couldn't speak, and sat in silence for the next 5 minutes until she stood up to leave. I'm sorry, Andrew. This has been lovely, but I have to go. His eyes turned slick, reptilian. Stay, Kelly. I have to go. Now. He stood up, and she didn't remember him being so damn tall, and she thought it looked as if his arms went down to his knees, and he flashed her another smile, almost mockingly, and she realized that even if she had a photo for reference, she could never count the teeth in his mouth. Let me walk you home at least. She began to feel faint, but the unexplainable terror of his mouth kept her alert. She said, loudly enough for tables near them in the restaurant to hear, "No." And that was that. Date number 2. Kelly can't sleep. The world seems to tune to static around her. They say she's crazy. There are 32 teeth in the average human mouth, Kelly. If you didn't like him, you can just say that, Kelly. So, she goes on the second, blearily sleep-starved. Through the fog, she can see he's charming, handsome. Her mother would like him. She drinks too much wine, again, but it helps her cope, helps her fight this rising sense inside her that maybe she's the crazy one. He kisses her outside, and she keeps her tongue firmly inside her mouth. She doesn't want to know. They walk home and get to her apartment, and maybe it's the wine or the sense of the inevitable, but she says nothing as she opens the door and enters her apartment wordlessly. He stands outside. Aren't you gonna invite me in? She shrugs, the universal sign for, what do you mean? Invite me in. She shrugs again, raises an eyebrow, gestures to the door with an arm, as if to say, you're more than welcome. He's getting angrier now. Let me in, Kelly. You need to invite me in. So... And he hisses the next part. Invite me in. And still she says nothing, terrified into silence, and he runs his tongue over his front teeth and says to her, in the manner a parent might scold a naughty child, "We want them back." And she can see his pink tongue all over his teeth, that multitude of tiny teeth that fill his mouth entirely, hundreds upon hundreds of them, and that black throat that extends endlessly backwards. And suddenly she's shaking her head, trembling in fear, and what she thought was a man lets out a screech, and his face goes red, and she can hear a sound like tearing wallpaper and nails on the chalkboard as he storms down the corridor. Her flatmates find her in a heap on the floor. They assume exhaustion and too much booze. She does not tell them the truth. Date number 3. She turns in and out of sleep over the next few days, speaking in her dreams about strange men and teeth and fairies. She does not know where the fairy part has come from, but it seems important, vital even. Her flatmates tell her she has to go on this last date, or they'll get her sectioned, call the services, have her mentally examined. She hears them talk in strange whispers about her. She's gone mental, lost it, nuts, schizo. And so, with no other choice, and beginning to doubt her own 2 eyes, she goes on the last date. She doesn't even make it to the restaurant before she trips and falls, and he's there. And he laughs and says this is one hell of an introduction. And he can see the huge bags under her eyes, and the way her skin has gone so pale, you can see the veins underneath. And so he calls a cab and puts her in it, and for a second, she thinks she's safe. But then, he's beside her, telling the cab driver where to go. How does he know her address? Why hers? And his arm is around her, and he's pulling her close and moving towards her neck, and she pushes him off, and as her hand forces his face back, it moves his lips, and she can see that mouth she has grown all too familiar with, and one of her fingers flips inside it, and she pulls it back as if it's been dipped in acid. She opens the cab door and rolls out onto the road and feels something snap in her arm, and her face feels wet with what seems to be blood. And as she runs as fast as she can away, she can hear him screaming from the open door, "We want them back. We need them back." To the untrained eye, it might seem like a robbery or a breakup, but ours is not the untrained eye, is it, dear reader? She is assessed medically. No broken ribs, minor bruising, small fracture in her arm. Lucky she didn't do any permanent damage, especially to her head. "I think the damage is already done there, Doc." Her right arm is put in a cast, and she is prescribed several pills to help her mental state. Which is why, when she proposes one last date, her flatmates are apprehensive. But she says she can see now where it all went wrong before, and how she was mistaken about the endless mouths and their teeth that crowd the gums, and that this time she will in fact be very good and hopes to get a boyfriend like the rest of you, handsome and charming and funny, and who might even help her. And so, her flatmates organize one more date. A real catch. A keeper. And the night before, they can hear noises from Kelly's room. Noises like someone installing plumbing. Sounds like someone chiseling stone or hitting metal, and the occasional wet gurgle or splash of a liquid. They do not ask questions. They don't want to know the answers. Date number 4. When she meets him, she's entirely silent to start with. He's heard that she's had a rough time recently, a mental episode, but she's recovering. And he's a nice guy, really, honest, so he just chats to her. His voice is a little nervous, but warm. He's trying to make her feel safe. She keeps her lips tightly shut. He says his name is Peter, and that she should tell him if he's talking too much, and that he always does, but it's just because he's nervous. Not because he loves the sound of his own voice. It's just one of those things, honest. She does not laugh. She does not smile. She does not look at him much, and when she does, her eyes stay away from his mouth. Until finally, towards the end of their walk, as they reach the cafe they agreed upon, he turns to her and says, "All right, look, I know it's not just the nerves. You haven't said anything this whole time. Am I doing anything wrong? Am I talking too much? Is there any way I can help?" And he thinks maybe he's pushed it too far, been too probing, but in response, she smiles. A smile that spreads, sneaking its way up each of her cheeks behind the greasy strands of hair. A smile so wide he can see her bloody, empty gums, red and swollen and wet. As he takes a step back, he thinks he can hear something coming from her mouth, although it's hard to make out any individual words. Whatever could be words become a mess of wet sounds, but through it all, straining, he thinks she's saying something like, "You'll never find them, you'll never find them," over and over. This is what he tells the police officer, at least. He says he has no idea what she's talking about, and offers a sheepish smile. The officer smiles in return. I will leave it to you, dear and diligent reader, to guess how many teeth Peter had, to guess the contents of his mouth. I will not say much more on the subject, except for the fact that they never found Kelly, and that they never found her teeth either. But they do say, if you keep quiet in the dead of night, when you wait for your child to fall asleep to swap their teeth for money, you might just be able to make out a faint, gurgling sound, and a voice as soft as the breeze, repeating the same 4 words, "You'll never find them." So, there it is, the first story from the book. I'd be happy to share others. I should mention one last thing, however. To keep it to myself would imply I'm hiding something, I suppose, which I'm not. I was reading the backside of a newspaper left on a bus when I found a story, something about a missing woman, a request for information. They gave a brief description of the woman, but in bold, as if to draw my eye to it, was her distinguishing feature. Last seen in East London, missing all her teeth. I remembered reading the story in the book a few weeks prior to finding the article on the bus, and that's why I found it all so strange. The events described in the article seemed to happen a week or so after I read it in the book. A strange coincidence, perhaps, or something else. I'm not too sure. I think the book has a funny way of talking to me. Every time I read it, I find something new, some story that seemed to be previously hidden away, as if the pages are just rooms whose inhabitants walk freely between them. When I opened the book, I'd already seen a hint of the story within, although I hadn't quite worked that out yet. A couple of days ago, I'd seen an article, read the headline, and then scrolled on. Something about a Scottish festival in the Highlands, an old, archaic festival only held by one village that celebrates something to do with the full moon. Like I said, I didn't pay much attention. Although, I wish I had now, because after reading this story, I tried to find it again, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the article. I don't believe it's gone completely. I just think it must have sunk back into the muck. Maybe you'll know what I'm talking about. If you do, please let me know. Regardless, here's the story I found in the book this morning. Kelpie, or Why You Should Never Trust a Man in the Moonlight. He knew, the first time he saw her, that they were bound together. He knew in the same way you know about a bruise or an open wound. He knew and said nothing. Instead, he watched in silence as she left a trail of wet footprints on the bone-dry pavement, and the seaweed glistened in her hair. He was just a boy then, and would not see her properly again until he was almost a man. He would see parts of her in his dreams, and now and again he'd think that he saw her in the village center, picking up on that familiar smell, driftwood and mud, and spying wet footprints on the stone. He would wait for her sometimes, and when, once a year, the town would almost double in population to celebrate the first full moon after the winter solstice, he would ignore the dozens of young women and men who streamed in, who drank cheap beer and sang in the streets, who would call to him to come and join when they saw him, who were drunk and young and only wanted company. It was Martin who found him a few weeks after his 18th birthday, alone. Martin sprawled beside him, stinking of whiskey and oil, his hands calloused and massive, and looked to him, eyes glazed. "Not joining the fun, boy?" He wanted to correct Martin, to tell him that he was a man now, not a boy, but he stayed silent. He stayed silent and glared. "Lots of pretty girls." A hiccup. "Boys, too, if that's your thing." He spoke up. It was the first time he would ever speak about her. and he was terrified for a moment that in actually putting it into words, he would realize how insane it all was. And Martin would laugh at him, call him crazy, and the whole thing would crash down around his ears. A girl. Martin grunted, a noise that said, "Go on." I've only seen her once." At the sound of this fact, Martin sat up, rested his elbow on his knees. His face gained a sudden seriousness that put years on him and cut through the alcohol-induced glaze. Martin looked at him, long and hard, as if working out some elaborate and dangerous puzzle. "What did she look like, this girl?" He did not want to admit what he'd seen, didn't want to be exposed as a fool, laughed out of town by a man 3 times his age. Martin passed him the bottle in silence, waiting. He realized then, taking a sip and wincing, that this was the only time Martin had ever treated him as an equal, as a man, and not a boy, and that Martin was really listening, and so he told the truth. He told the truth about the seaweed in her hair and the trail of wet footprints, and that he knew they were bound together. Martin stayed silent, biting his lower lip and rubbing the graying stubble on his jaw. He could suddenly see Martin's age, the bags under his eyes, the slouch in his posture, the gnarled fingers, and something else. A gravity that lay behind Martin's jolly exterior, a sense that whatever they were sharing now was not only real, but important. Martin asked him how he knew they were bound together. He said he knew, the same way you know about a bruise or an open wound. Martin nodded. Right answer. The movement was more towards himself than anything else, but while he stood up, he beckoned the boy to follow. They retrieved a rabbit from a large hutch in the back of Martin's garden first, picking one that was huge and gray, and that went limp with fear when they shone a torch in its face. They walked in silence away from the village for an hour, perhaps more, until they took a route through a thin strip of woods. They emerged in the moonlight, only the shore of a vast and still lake. The moonlight illuminated the stretch of shore around them, and he could see the light like a white tongue upon the lake's surface. They were surrounded by silence, a silence that seemed to be a question as opposed to a response, as if it was asking them, "What now?" Martin chose to answer. He turned and spoke softly but firmly. "You do not stay in the water for long. You put the prey maybe 2-3 feet out at most. Then you sit by the shore and wait. Under no circumstances do you get in the lake. This is the closest you'll ever get." He did not entirely understand, but the tone had shifted in Martin's voice. These were less like instructions and more like commandments. Martin's tone reminded him of the vicar in church when he spoke about fire and brimstone. It was the same grave certainty, the same notes of apprehension and awe. Martin stuck a small needle in the rabbit and handed it to him. He followed Martin's instructions to the letter and pushed the rabbit out. The thing had just enough energy to thrash as it half sank. He waited. The ripples the rabbit made seemed to attract something larger, something that moved from the center of the lake, underwater, only just disturbing the surface, a swell that grew and grew as it approached the rabbit. He almost couldn't believe his eyes. Except, dear reader, he could. Because he'd known this all along, the same way you know about a broken bone. A dark horse came from the depths, black and huge, and dripping with lake water, with eyes as red as embers, a horse that had weeds for a mane and sharp teeth that glinted in the light. The horse seemed to form itself from the water instead of emerging from under it. as if its very DNA was liquid, and it swallowed the rabbit in 2 bites. There was the crunch of bone and the wet sound of the beast swallowing. And then, as if the horse form was water, the horse melted away and revealed the girl, pale and naked in the moonlight, her mouth and chin wet with the blood of the rabbit. But she was a woman now, and when she looked at him, he ached like he'd never ached before, and every inch of her skin made him breathless, and try as he might, he couldn't take his eyes off her, and he knew he would do whatever it took to see her again. He watched her from the shore, studied her as she studied him. He knew he loved her, knew he always had. And I must make it clear at this point, dear reader, that she loved him. She who was made from water and who had only been a horse thing a second ago, loved him. But she loved him the way wild beasts love, with teeth and claws, and in the dark. When she finally slipped back into the water, he heard Martin speak up. In all honesty, he'd entirely forgotten Martin was there. But as Martin spoke, he could hear the words slur and shake, and realized that Martin had been drinking the entire time. Martin warned him that a rabbit wouldn't work next time, warned him that she'd be hungrier. He laughed and said he'd bring whatever it took, no matter if it was a deer or a goat or a cow. Martin said nothing, stared ahead, looked to him, eyes wet with tears. He understood then. He knew what it would take and why it could not be said, and why Martin had made sure that he really loved her. From that day on, his life took 2 separate paths. He married young, perhaps to distract himself from her, or perhaps because he thought he should. They married in a village on the other side of the country, as far away from the lake as possible. But the lake and the horse and the girl lurked in his mind, like an itch he couldn't scratch. Every year, he'd return to the village, make excuses as to why he couldn't bring his wife, with his heart in his mouth. He'd use whatever he had to, old-fashioned dating sites, ads in magazines. He would meet young men and drink with them, dance with them, eat with them during the height of the festival before taking them to the lake. He would tell them he was going to show them something that would change their lives. And, in his own way, he was right. He did not enjoy it. If you'd have asked, he would have said he was a good man who was made to do bad things. I'll leave it up to you to decide. He knew vets and doctors, and it wasn't hard to create a solution. Ketamine infused, just enough to render his victims able to move an inch, just enough to send those ripples into the center of the lake, ripples that he would watch with a dry mouth and his heart going so fast it felt like it was vibrating. And without fail, she would come. She came first as the horse thing, the thing that he began to call Kelpie, a Scottish legend that he now knew was real in the way only myths can be, that would bare its teeth that grew larger year on year, with its black body glistening and huge in the moonlight, that would make short work of whatever he'd brought for it. That twitching body in the shallows. And then once it was full, her. The water would fall away, retreating like sea spray from cliff face, and it would reveal her, naked and pale in the moonlight, weeds in her hair, and those eyes that would lock with his. The light cast strange shadows over her body, over her thighs and stomach and arms, and he would watch with bated breath as she walked closer and closer to shore. He would watch her chest rise and fall as she took deep breaths, perhaps the only breaths she would take each year. He did not know. and watch as the blood mixed with water, dark and then clear, and then joined the lake. Those moments, just the two of them, separate but together, made it all worth it. At this point in the story, you would have every right to call him a murderer or the worst kind of criminal, and I would be inclined to agree with you. The difficulty is, dear reader, that he cannot hear either of us. Even if he could, he would not have listened. He was alone with his love and his lust and that vast, still lake. His double life continued, pretty much unchanged, murderer and husband, until the birth of his first child. The birth was about a month before the festival, and he made his excuses in advance. How he'd be only gone for a night, and that it was important, and that he'd be back with both of them before they knew it. That night, the night of the festival, there was a storm. It was a storm so huge that the air seemed to crackle with static, and the rain lashed the soil in waves, and lightning forked in the distance. At this point, he would sometimes even forget their names and simply drag them to the lake with offers of sex or drugs. This time, as he watched the twitching body out into the shallows and waited, he noticed that the lightning was growing closer. So close, in fact, that every time it struck the ground, it would illuminate the whole world in a blanket of light. This would last just long enough for him to see as far as the horizon, clear as day. And in these flashes of light that would break the sky only a second or two after the thunder, he saw something that changed him forever. Something that if he'd really thought about, he should have known all along. Along the shore of the lake, as far as he could see, were hundreds and hundreds of tiny figures, and in front of each of these tiny figures was a shape bobbing in the shallows. And as he saw her appear from the lake, the horse thing, the kelpie, and he saw those eyes like embers, he saw the same scene happening hundreds and hundreds of times over along the shore of the lake, and he realized that he wasn't alone, and never had been, and that every man in the village was out tonight with their own offering, their own prey, and they were all feeding their own horse things, their own kelpies, that they didn't own, that they couldn't touch, but only see, feeding the very lake itself. When she turned into a woman and squatted by the edge of the lake, he grew closer than he'd ever been, filled with a newfound courage, a courage found in the knowledge that he wasn't alone, close enough to see things he'd never seen before, the slight webbing of her fingers and toes, the sharp hooks on the back of her feet. From then on, his life became easier. The festival still filled him with a strange sense of apprehension, but it was soothed by the knowing looks of the men of the village, the nods that said so much, and the way the men would slowly filter out from the bars and pubs and parks, all with a partner, headed towards the vast and still lake, with one thing on their minds. Years passed, and every year he'd shuffle a little closer to the water, a little closer to her. But his victims' faces all began to blur into one, and this blurred, vague face would keep him up at night. He'd hear it speaking in the static on the radio, and watch its lips move in the mirror. Sometimes, when he hadn't slept, he would even see the blurred thing stretched across the face of his son. He was in his 40s when he decided he couldn't take it anymore. I don't know what drove him to it, and I'm not sure he did either. Perhaps the weight of what he'd done finally dawned on him. Perhaps it was an argument with his now ex-wife. Perhaps it was the knowledge that soon his son would discover the lake, one way or another, and he wasn't sure which was worse, His son crouched by the shore, holding a syringe and shaking with lust, or his son as a body, twitching and dead-eyed in the shallows. Whatever it was, that year he did not contact anymore. He did not reach out on any dating sites or addict forums or try and meet anyone at the bar. He attended the festival alone with a grim look in his eyes. The men of the village that he saw knew that look well and did not try and talk him out of it. He made the walk to the lake alone and stood by the shore for a while, breathing in the smell one last time. The smell of driftwood and mud. He took off his clothes, folded them into a small pile, which he slipped under a fallen log. He took off his boots, his underwear, and stood naked in the moonlight. Then he started to walk out into the lake. He loved her more than he could put into words, and that love weighed on him and pulled him deeper and deeper into the lake. I do not know what he was expecting, but she loved him too, and when she found him, she loved him the only way she knew how, with teeth and claws, and in the dark. And when his wife pleaded with a local policeman to check the lake, stating that this village was the last place he'd mentioned, and that she knew he walked to that lake even though he tried to hide it, she was met with silence. When his wife asked men in the town, men that ran the pubs and the bars, and who worked at the shops, the men who had wives and husbands and sons and daughters, the men who prayed at church and who taught at the school, the men who drank and swore and spat, the men who loved and laughed and cried, she was always met with the same stony silence. They knew where he was, the same way you know about a bruise or an open wound. I wish I could say I entirely believed this story. The fact that the festival occurs every year and every man in the village manages to bring someone for their kelpie just doesn't seem likely to me. Surely that amount of disappearances, so localized, would be noticed by someone. But then again, maybe the story isn't there to be believed, or maybe only parts of it are. I'm still figuring this book out, I suppose. I wonder if he's with her now at the bottom of that vast and still lake, or if he died in the shallows, like the rest of them. Have you ever lost someone you loved? Someone who was such an important part of your life that losing them ripped everything out of you and left you as nothing but an empty husk? I have. Grief does things to a person. It can destroy them, and the scars will never heal. Not really. Suddenly the world seems like a darker place. You wish you'd had more time, and you cling to the memories of what time you did have. You wish that you could go back and have just one more minute with them. Just one. That's all you want. That was all I wanted. Abigail Swan believed that the world was a magical place. She'd been obsessed with mystery and seemed so certain that if she looked hard enough, she could pull back the veil and see the things that humanity was never meant to see. When I first asked her out, I did so before Halloween, and our first date was during a local ghost walk. Seeing how excited she was as we followed the group from place to place and listened to the horrific tales of pain and suffering that haunted our lonely city streets only made me fall deeper in love with her. She had the most wonderful, mischievous grin that made her dark eyes sparkle, and that night led to many others. Abandoned cabins, deserted theme parks, quiet forests. We visited them all together as we grew from a cute high school couple into young lovers, planning our future together. As time went by, we talked of marriage, mortgages, and even children. She wanted to get married in an abandoned church. Abigail was a force of nature, an unstoppable person who saw magic and beauty everywhere she went, and she made me see it too. Maybe if I'd taken a different route that day, I'd still have her with me. Some local kids decided to mix booze in Daddy's fast car. They ran a red light, and they hit me on the passenger side before I could even react. The boys were fine. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital, and Abigail, she didn't even make it that far. The months after her death were the hardest. My body might have healed, but it was the only thing that did. I felt her absence in every waking moment. I pored over her old photographs as mutual friends offered me empty condolences. I knew they meant well, but their support didn't change what I'd lost. They didn't cushion the pain that I felt. Nothing really could. I would have given anything to undo what had been done, or to even have one more minute with Abigail. Anything. That's why I did it. It's why I played the mall game. I didn't know if it would work, and I knew that in the unlikely event that it did, I'd probably end up killing myself in the process. But given the state I was in, and what it promised, I couldn't say no. Like I said before, grief does things to a person. It sends them to dark places. And in those places, there are often other things waiting. I'd first heard about the mall game through Abigail. It's not a well-known ritual. I'd never heard of anyone who'd completed it successfully, but with all the details out there, someone must have. Those who attempted it usually failed to even start it correctly, although if you dig deep, you might find some rumors of people who tried to play it and disappeared. Supposedly, if you manage to beat the mall game, you'll be allowed access to another world. In there, you would have your choice of prizes: worldly possessions, riches, knowledge, and if you choose, an opportunity to speak to the dead. The catch is, you can only take one prize, and if you were to beat the mall game, you can never, ever play it again. You have one chance to play, and one chance to win. In order to even play the game, you must have recently lost someone close to you, otherwise it won't work. However, if you have, and you are still reeling from the grief, you need to visit any large indoor mall of your choosing. It doesn't matter where it is. It just needs to be a large indoor mall. A strip mall won't work. You need to enter first thing in the morning and make sure that you are the very first one to set foot inside the mall that day. Then you need to approach the nearest kiosk and ask the person working there, "What time does the mall close today?" Their answer is very important. If they do anything other than smile at you and say, "Stay and find out," then you have failed. However, if they smile and they say those words, then the game begins. My city has a very large mall near the highway that I knew would serve my purposes perfectly. I made sure to be there bright and early on a weekday, when they might not be as busy in the morning. I thought it might be easier to be the first person inside that way. The mall opened at 10 in the morning, and when the doors were unlocked that day, I was inside before they'd even fully opened. The underpaid employee who I'd pushed past shot me a dirty look as I made a beeline for the nearest kiosk, a cell phone provider. Common sense told me that this wouldn't work. Even if the mall game was real, it was such a long shot that I'd actually trigger it. But if it was, if I had a chance to speak to Abigail one last time, I needed to take it. I needed to see her again. The kiosk sat just ahead of me, and the employee there looked over at me as I drew closer. They probably thought I was there to browse or buy. There was no way they'd have expected the question I asked. "Excuse me, What time does the mall close? Their initial expression was one of surprise, and I felt my heart sink. I was so sure I'd failed at the first step, and then I saw their smile. Their eyes met mine, their gaze both knowing and mocking. "Stay and find out," they replied. Their tone was almost condescending. Those 4 words sent a chill through me. For a moment, I wasn't sure I'd actually heard them correctly. The kiosk employee chuckled and turned away from me, leaving me standing dumbfounded by their counter. Finally, I pulled away, as I realized that it had worked. I'd successfully begun the mall game. That knowledge filled me with both elation and a quiet dread. Elation because for the first time, I felt just the slightest spark of hope. Dread because I knew what would come next. The mall game is fundamentally a game of tag. By beginning it, you invite something else into the mall with you. Just what exactly it is up for debate. Most people just call it the hunter. Some people said that the hunter would look like any other mall patron, and they'd be difficult to pick out from a crowd. There would be subtle things to distinguish them, but it was never specified exactly what those things might be. What is agreed upon is that once the mall game has begun, you cannot exit the mall at any time because the hunter will continue to follow you if you do. The only way to get rid of it is to win the game, which is easier said than done. In order to win, you need to remain within the mall until it closes. You cannot be caught, and you cannot leave. You must avoid the hunter until the hour before the mall closes, and then you begin the next step of the game. The mall I was in closed at 9. That left me with about 10 hours until the game was finished. I knew that the hunter would be entering soon, and I had every intention of avoiding it when it came. I figured that I'd try a pragmatic approach. Obviously, the hunter was going to come straight for me, so why not find a place where I'd be able to see it coming? Somewhere open and central. The food court, for instance. I could feel nervous palpitations in my chest as I headed there, keeping a distance from any other shoppers I saw. No one that I passed stuck out to me in any noticeable way. They were just average people going about their business. The food court was more or less empty when I got there. Some of the restaurants weren't even open yet. The few that were didn't interest me. I doubted I'd be able to hold down any food I ate. My stomach churned too much, and I hadn't had much of an appetite in the past few weeks anyways. I found a table where I could look out on the rest of the mall, and I waited, drumming my fingers impatiently on the table as I watched strangers pass by. I figured that anyone traveling in a group was probably safe. Everything I'd read suggested that there would only be one hunter, so I waited for it. I don't think I waited long either. My fingers drummed anxiously on the table as I saw a pale, bald man in a suit walking slowly past the food court. I expected him to look at me, but he remained stoic and looked straight ahead before he disappeared from my sight. I spotted a young mother and her 2 children entering the food court. The kids looked at me, but they didn't seem all that threatening. I spotted a lonely old lady with a walker around the corner, but I didn't linger on her too long. My fingers kept drumming as I eyed a group of teenagers passing by and watched as they entered the food court. They were all pierced and dressed in black, although I noticed that one of them trailed behind the others. They looked at me, and as they did, I realized that the air around me felt a little colder than before. My eyes remained locked on the androgynous teenager who frowned before looking at their phone and jogging to catch up to their friends. I watched them for a moment longer before conceding that they weren't the hunter, although that new chill in the air made me uneasy. The room seemed darker than before, and I looked over to the other side of the food court, hoping to catch sight of any newcomers, Before I noticed the old woman again, she weaved slowly through the tables as she approached me. Her serious eyes never left me, and that intense glare made me feel uneasy. She couldn't have been more than 10 feet away from me, and as she slowly came closer, I felt the room getting colder as the lights around me dimmed. Her very presence seemed to cast a shadow and suck all the warmth from the air around her. My every instinct told me to get up, but my body would not obey. As the old woman closed the distance between us, I could feel the world around me going dark, and in that dark, I saw her features begin to change. Where once an old woman had stood, now stood something else entirely. It lurched towards me, its skin clammy and gray, its eyes sunken and skeletal, and yet what was beneath that rotten skin was only barely human. I saw blistered lips curl into a grin as fresh pus dribbled from the sores. My nostrils were filled with an overwhelming stench of coppery blood as the hunter drew nearer. I'd foolishly come in believing that the mall game would be easy to play. I'd thought I could easily evade the hunter once it revealed itself to me. No doubt I hadn't been the first to think that. Running sounds simple in concept, but when faced with what hides behind the veil, your body doesn't respond. You sit there, like a deer in the headlights, watching it come for you, throat full of gnashing rotten teeth and the stink of rotting flesh wafting from its threshing maw. I knew in that moment why others had gone missing. Either they hadn't seen the hunter coming, or they'd been paralyzed with fear when they saw it, just like I was. I sat in that seat in the food court, pulled into whatever cold darkness the hunter had brought with it as it advanced on me. I knew that when it took me, no one would even notice. I would be dismissed as another disappearance, and I would be forgotten. In what I was sure would be my final moments, I pictured Abigail and hoped that maybe I might see her on the other side. I imagined her mischievous smile and her sweet laugh, a laugh I would have done anything to hear again. Even that game, with the hunter only feet away from me, skeletal hands reaching for my throat to snatch me and drag me into its mouth, I found the strength to move. At last I screamed and launched myself backwards off the chair. As I put some distance between myself and the hunter, I saw the world around me get brighter. A few strangers noticed me and looked over in my direction, but I paid them no mind. As I stumbled away from the hunter, I saw that it seemed more human. The further I got, the more it looked like a harmless old lady. The effect was similar to those images you see sometimes when you move and the image changes into something else. Lenticular painting, I think it's called. Yet even with its harmless disguise back up, I still knew what that creature really was. I suppose, in a sense, my plan had worked. In fact, it had worked too well. I knew what was after me. I knew exactly what it was, and even once I'd turned to run, I could still smell the rotting flesh of the idiots who tried and failed to play the mall game before me. I must have looked like an idiot, taking off at top speed out of the food court and away from that harmless-looking old lady, but I didn't care. No one else would have seen what I'd seen, and if they did, God help them. I looked back only once as I left the food court, and I saw the old lady several feet behind me. She'd moved faster than I'd expected, but I'd still put some distance between us. I rushed up one of the nearby escalators to the second floor, where I was sure I'd be safe for the time being. From the second floor, I watched the old lady following me towards the escalator. She kept a steady pace, and her gaze was always fixated directly on me. I looked back at her before turning to leave. I didn't run. but I kept a brisk pace, intending not to let her catch up to me again. The first hour was only barely done. I had 9 more to go. Part of me considered heading for the door of the mall, catching the bus, and heading home. But the warnings I'd read had been clear. Leaving the mall at any time would not get rid of the hunter. The game would end, and the hunter would continue to pursue me until it inevitably got me. No, to leave would be to die. Plain and simple. Judging by what I'd seen behind that harmless old lady facade, it would be a very painful death, too. No, I wasn't going to leave. Not at all. Hiding was out of the question, too. The hunter would know where I was immediately, so I'd only be wasting my time and possibly cornering myself as well. On the subject of cornering myself, going into any of the stores would probably also be a mistake. Mall stores generally only have one entrance that is also their exit. I didn't know how smart the hunter was, but if it happened to catch me in one of the smaller stores, all it would need to do is wait by the entrance for me to come out, and it would have me. A better strategy seemed to be to simply keep moving. The mall had a circuit to it that I could follow. I could move between the upstairs and downstairs, and it would allow me to stay ahead of the hunter. I'd just do laps around the mall for the day, until it was time to find a store and end the game. I could do that, right? For the first couple of hours, things went well. I kept a close eye on the hunter, who I kept at about a 30-foot distance. It followed me up and down escalators, keeping its steady pace as it pursued me. Its eyes never once left me. Despite its appearance as an old lady, I figured that it moved just about as quickly as I did. Despite how terrifying my first encounter with it had been, I caught myself feeling confident that I might just win this after all. By the time noon had rolled around, my confidence was starting to wane. I'm not exactly a health nut, but I consider myself at least somewhat in shape. Keeping a brisk pace to keep the hunter away from me, though, was far more trying than I'd expected. As I felt myself starting to tire, I made myself get further ahead in the vain hope that if I put some distance between myself and the hunter, I might just buy myself some time to rest. It didn't take long to leave her behind as I headed back towards the food court. I was hoping that I might grab a drink or something to keep myself ready to go. There were no rules in the ritual explicitly forbidding you from stopping to eat or drink at any point in time. I'd even heard some people encouraging you to eat or buy food during the game. There would be no opportunity to eat for some time once it was all over. I was on the second floor and was getting close to the escalator that led down towards the food court when I felt a familiar drop in the temperature around me. I paused and looked backwards, expecting to see the hunter behind me, but there was no one. The lights around me were starting to dim again, and I remained frozen, unsure of what was close to me. Was there something else nearby? A second hunter, perhaps? The descriptions I'd read hadn't said anything about that. And then from the corner of my eye, I saw her. I'm not sure when she got down to the lower level, or when she'd caught up to me. But there she was, that same little old lady riding the escalator up to me. Her eyes were fixated on me, like they always were, and I could see something shifting behind her human facade. I recoiled on instinct away from the escalator, and I broke into a run, putting some more distance between us. Not too much this time, though. I didn't want to lose track of her again. I watched as she reached the top of the escalator and resumed her steady pursuit of me. I could hear my blood pounding in my ears, and I could have sworn I saw a wry smile on her lips. Suddenly, I wasn't very thirsty anymore. Over the next few hours, I kept moving. Whenever I got tired or wanted to stop, she was there. I learned very quickly that if I got too far ahead of her, she'd find a way to get close to me again. About 5 hours into the game, I saw her come out of a store in front of me when I was sure she'd been behind me. Not long after, I saw her coming straight for me when, again, I'd last seen her 20 feet behind me. As the day went on, she became more and more aggressive. The mall itself began to feel wrong. I was sure I'd followed the circuit that led around the mall exclusively. However, every now and then, I'd find myself disoriented. Routes that had looped around last time seemed to end in doors out. Stores that I'd passed before began to pop up in the wrong places. Maybe it was just the exhaustion, or maybe it was something else entirely. Through it all, that damn old lady behind me kept up her brisk pace, and so did I. I made myself move just a little slower, choose my paths more deliberately. Near the end of it, my legs felt sore as if I'd been hiking all day. I was thirsty, hungry, and I was tired. Every little group of benches or chairs I passed looked so inviting that I considered resting for just a moment. I only actually tried it once. As soon as I'd sat down, I felt the air grow colder, and I saw the lights around me growing dim. The first 2 times it had frightened me. This time it angered me. From the corner of my eye, I saw the hunter approaching, and I growled in frustration. Something deep, primal, and angry in me made me want to lash out at it. A far more rational part of my mind told me to run. Despite my mind telling me to fight, I chose to run anyways. When I finally heard the announcement, I can't tell you how tired I was.
Attention, shoppers,
A voice said over the intercom.
the mall will be closing in 1 hour.
I wasn't sure how much longer I'd be able to keep moving. It had been 10 hours at that point, but it felt like days. At the sound of the announcement, I looked back towards the hunter behind me. The old lady just continued her stoic march towards me, and I moved away from her with a renewed vigor. Just a little bit further, then I could rest. To win the mall game, you need to find a store, preferably a large one with a bed, although in theory you could probably use any store. Once you get there, you'll need to tell an employee that you are invited, and no matter what they tell you or how much they plead, you must answer their every question with yes. After that, they will take you to a safe place where you can sleep, and you can finally claim your prize. Thoughts of Abigail filled my mind as I made my way to a local department store. It was large, and I knew they sold mattresses. It seemed like the ideal place to go for the final part of the game. As I stepped inside, I looked back towards the hunter behind me. It had kept up its steady pace, and though I'd been told I wouldn't have to worry about it for much longer, I was still worried. They were still about 40 feet back by the time I entered the store, and with the last of my energy, I made myself jog over to a nearby customer service counter. The kid working there couldn't have been older than 16. He was tall and plain-looking, with glasses and acne. He seemed a little annoyed that I'd come up to him. "How can I help you?" he asked. "I am invited," I replied, my eyes meeting his and hoping desperately for a reaction. He stared back at me and frowned before he nodded. "Okay," he said. His voice was softer now, understanding even. He left the desk and headed further into the store, gesturing for me to follow. I looked back. The old lady had followed me inside and still tailed me, although she seemed slower than before. She seemed to be watching me instead of hunting me now. I let the young man lead me to the bedding department, where several mattresses waited. He stopped in front of one of them and looked back over at me. His expression was dour and uncertain. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "If you accept, you may not like what you find." Yes, I replied. I kept my tone even. The kid didn't seem to like that. I don't think you understand, he said with more urgency. Look, you won, that's obvious. Why don't you take the win and go? I really don't think this is worth it. Are you really going to accept the invitation? Yes, I replied again, and I saw frustration rising in the boy's eyes. Why? What could be so important that you'd actually accept? Do you actually know how much danger you're in? Are you stupid? Suicidal? What? If you do this, you may not come back anyways. Those prizes have a price, and one day it must be paid back. Are you really going to accept the invitation? Yes, I replied again, as I saw the boy's frustration turn into rage. I wasn't offended by it. This was all part of what needed to be done. A final test of resolve before I could claim my prize. It was trivial compared to what I'd already been through. Go to hell. I hope you get ripped apart. What do you think is so important that you'd go this far? Money? Knowledge? Something else? It's not worth it. His expression hardened. Abigail is dead, Michael. The fact that he said my name sent a chill through me, and he knew he'd caught me off guard. Oh, yeah, I know who you are, Michael Warren. And I know you're wasting your time. Why would you torture yourself by going down to see her? What do you think she'll say? Is this worth it, dipshit? Huh? Is it? Are you going to accept the invitation? Yes. Screw you. Angry tears began to stream down the kid's face. Don't do this. Please don't do this. Don't. You don't need to throw your life away. I'm telling you, you're gonna die if you accept. He grabbed me by the shoulders, his tearful eyes meeting mine. I stared back without emotion. This, too, was just part of the test, and when all was said and done, the kid probably wouldn't even remember a word he'd said. Are you going to accept the invitation? He asked one last time. Yes, I said. He looked into my eyes, tears still flowing, before wiping them away. Fine, the kid spat. Fine, do what you must. With that, he pulled away from me and took off. From the corner of my eye, I saw the old lady standing there. She was close enough where I should have felt a drop in temperature, but instead she just stood still and watched me calmly. Her expression was stoic and impossible to read. I stared back at her, and she let out a huff of approval. Huh. Decently played, I suppose, she said. Her voice was deeper than an old lady should have been. There was a coldness to it. I didn't reply. I didn't know how to, and I suspect I didn't need to. Without a further word, the thing that looked like an old lady turned and walked away from me. I was alone with the bed, and there was only one thing left to do. My body was exhausted from the day. The bed was soft and welcoming when I lay down on it, and as the mall closed, I shut my eyes and drifted off into a dreamless sleep. When I awoke, the world was quiet. The lights were off, but I could see a pinkish twilight shining through the windows of the department store. As I sat up and got out of bed, I noticed a stale smell in the air. I knew that it had worked. I was in the other world. I made note of the bed I'd been in before I approached the door into the department store. I didn't dare open it. Leaving the mall while in the other world would prevent me from ever returning home. I saw a few idle cars waiting in the parking lot, and on the street beyond them, I thought I saw glimpses of dark figures moving about. I didn't try to look too closely at them. The sky above looked to be an ominous pink. I stared up at it and felt as if it was staring back into me before I pulled away from the door and headed back towards the interior of the mall itself. The whole place seemed to be in a state of disrepair. Broken glass and debris littered the floor. Food I passed in some of the aisles was spoiled, and silence enveloped the place like a cloud. I could hear my footsteps echoing off the walls as I walked through the hallways of the mall and looked for a pathway down to the treasure I so desperately sought. It didn't take me long to find it. Over the past several hours, I had become very familiar with the layout of the mall. It was easy to tell when something was out of place, and the stairway on the ground level that inexplicably led downwards was certainly out of place. I approached it slowly, and I could see a dim red light shining from down below. It pulsated like a heartbeat. I began my descent, unconsciously holding my breath as I did. My footsteps echoed off the marble floor beneath me as I set my foot down into the lower level. I'm not sure exactly what I expected to see down there. Another mall level wasn't it. In fact, what I found there seemed mundane compared to what I was expecting. I could see countless storefronts, most of them recognizable. The only catch was that they were empty. Neon signs and posters advertised video games and movies. I spotted what looked like some sort of kiddie ride in one corner and some sort of massage parlor in the other. This was what I'd come so far for? No, not quite. The accounts I'd read of the mall game said that there were a few different prizes one could choose. The first was worldly possessions, and everything I saw certainly seemed to fit that bill. While there were things that tempted me, shallow things like games, rides, and movies weren't what I'd come so far for. "These prizes have a price," the kid had said before I'd slept. No doubt if I touched anything, I'd need to give it back at some point. I looked straight ahead and began to walk again. In the distance, I could see another staircase leading down, and I jogged towards it before I began to descend again. The next floor was more drastically different. This one barely resembled the mall I'd been through. The layout was the same, but the storefronts were gone. In their place were alcoves filled with things that made me pause. Great golden statues with jeweled bodies watched me like silent shopkeepers. I saw golden coins and ingots scattered about and piled up in amongst the nooks where the stores once were. Jewels as large as my head were dotted amongst the gold. Emeralds, rubies, sapphires, even diamonds. Just one would be enough to see me set for life, and I caught myself approaching one of them before stopping. I didn't let myself lay a hand on anything there. Like the kid said, there was a price, and as wonderful as those treasures were, I suspected it would be higher than I'd care to pay. Besides, this treasure, marvelous as it was, wasn't what I'd come for. If I took anything, I wouldn't be able to go deeper. I wouldn't be able to see Abigail again. It took more restraint than I'd expected to pull myself away from some of the treasures I saw and look straight ahead again. Sure enough, I could see another stairway in the distance, and I made myself go to it. I wanted to take one final glance at the treasures behind me, but I didn't let myself. I just made myself go down the next set of stairs. The fourth level was truly massive, larger than it should have been at a glance. It bore no resemblance to the mall above me, and barely resembled any library that I'd ever seen. Massive shelves jam-packed with books seemed to span onwards into infinity. As I passed them, I skimmed some of their titles, and many of them gave me pause. They promised secrets, truths about the universe that anyone would want to know. Are we alone? Why were we made? How did the universe begin? How will it end? If I were a weaker man, I would have given in to the temptation, but I'd already come so far. I could stand to go a little further. As before, there was one final set of stairs up ahead, and I knew what was waiting for me beyond them. I tore my gaze away from the books as I approached the stairs and began my final descent. And there, I found myself on a city street. The street was a familiar one I'd seen before. It stretched onwards into the night, and when I looked up, I could see the stars above me. When I looked back, I could see stars. This place made no sense, but after all I'd gone through, I can't say it surprised me much. The street looked just as it had on that Halloween night several years ago, the night that Abigail and I had taken that ghost walk around town. Our very first date.
There must be someone very important to you if you've come all this way,
A voice said, and I turned to address it. The old woman who'd hunted me through the mall stood patiently before me. Her expression seemed a little softer than before. Yes, I said. Yes, she is very important. The old woman cracked a knowing smile.
Very well then, I'll leave you to it. But know that of each reward here, you may only have one luxury, one treasure, one secret, and one more hour of time with she who you've lost.
My heart sank for a moment, but I nodded. I understand, I said. The old woman nodded back at me before she took off down the street. I watched her go. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I heard her voice. Mikey? She was behind me. I knew that voice. I knew her. Slowly, I turned to face her, and when I saw her standing on the sidewalk, dressed as she'd been the day she died, I broke. Tears filled my eyes as I ran to her and I scooped her up in my arms, holding her so tightly that I was sure I'd never let her go. I felt Abigail's arms close around me in turn, and in that moment, I knew I was home. I looked up at her and I cupped her cheeks as I kissed her. Mikey, what are you doing here? Did you... No. You're not. I'm alive, I promised her. I played the mall game and I won. I get to see you again. I saw her eyes widen for a moment. Disbelief, fear, and finally excitement crossed her face and culminated in that smile I loved so dearly. That smile made everything worth it. You actually played the mall game? She asked. Oh my God, you dumbass. You really did, didn't you? I really did, I said. I had to see you one more time. I had to say goodbye. She caressed my cheek, her smile fading slightly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. I could see the tears welling up before she kissed me one last time. We talked. For one last time, she and I sat at the place where we'd began, and we talked. Maybe it wasn't much, but it was enough for me. I told her I loved her. I told her I was sorry. I told her that I didn't know what I'd do without her, and as I spoke, as I cried, she held me close. "You gonna be okay?" She promised me. Death is scary, but it's peaceful too. I'm okay. You don't need to worry about me. So just worry about you. All right, Mikey? She brushed my hair from my eyes. I know it's going to be hard, but when you get back up there, keep going. You've still got a life to live. Don't waste it. I'll be down here when you're done. I promise. I almost laughed at that. She giggled a little bit too. I just don't think my life will ever be the same without you, I said. She shrugged. Who says that's a bad thing? Look, I know we didn't get to do everything we wanted to while I was up there, but that doesn't mean you should give up on it. It's okay if you need some time, but when you're ready, find someone. You deserve to be happy, Mikey, and I don't want you lingering on me. Like I said, I'll be here, and when we see each other again, I want to hear all about the things you did. Go out and live your life. Do it for me. Her cold hand closed over mine. I squeezed it affectionately. All right, I promised. When I'm ready, I will. She kissed my cheek as she wrapped her other arm around me, and we cuddled close as our time ran out. In the distance, a clock chimed, and I looked up. Our hour had passed, and we both knew it. Abigail let go of my hand and stood up. You should go. I'll see you soon, I guess. Hopefully not too soon. She forced a smile, and I did the same. Hopefully, I replied. Take care of yourself, okay? I always do. You too, Mikey. You too. She walked me to the stairwell. I gave her one last parting look, and she offered me a reassuring smile before she let go of my hand. Part of me wanted to beg her to come with me, but I knew it wasn't possible. There was no undoing what was done. All I could do was live with it. I began to ascend the stairs, tears still in my eyes. At the top, I found the first floor of the mall, not the library. I looked back down towards the stairs, only to see that they were gone. There was only a plain tile floor behind me. Tears streamed down my cheeks, but I still found it in myself to smile. Whatever price I'd have to pay one day, it would be worth it. For that one moment I'd gotten, it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was better than what I'd had. I returned to the department store where the bed waited for me and lay down once more. I wiped the tears away one last time before I drifted back off to sleep. When I awoke again, the mall was opening for the next day. As the doors unlocked, I stepped out of them and looked up into a familiar blue sky. The cool air was crisp in my lungs as I walked away from the mall. My grief still felt heavy in my soul, but the burden felt a little lighter. As I left the mall behind, I walked towards an uncertain future. I didn't know what lay ahead of me, but for the first time since Abigail died, I felt hopeful. And I knew that one day I would be all right again. Hey everyone, remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Huge thank you to the author, Head of Spectre. Make sure to check out more of their work. There's a link in the description. If you'd like to support me further, there's a link to my Patreon in the description. And remember, if you decide to play the mall game, make sure you're in really good shape and probably bring a snack. Have a good night. I can't tell you exactly where, but in the middle of nowhere in the southwestern United States, there's a supermax prison that I'll call Asher State Penitentiary, or ASP for short. That's not its real name, but it'll do. Now, as with most maximum security prisons, there are some genuinely sick people there. Murderers, psychopaths, rapists. You know, the kinds of people who can probably never be allowed back into society. A lot of people claim that it simply isn't possible to escape from this prison. And maybe they're right. I really hope that they are. Not because I'm afraid of the sickos they've got in the cells. I mean, I am. Of course I am. But even the most disturbed serial-killing necrophiliacs they've got in there don't scare me as much as what they've got in their basement. I don't think most of the regular staff is fully aware of the prison's other inmates. I've heard rumors that some of the guards are aware that something is up, but they either don't care or they know better than to ask questions. I imagine they probably think it's some government lab or something, running experiments that may or may not be entirely ethical on convicted felons. Some people would say that might arguably be preferable to the truth. They have your standard security procedures, of course. For starters, inmates aren't allowed to have any contact with each other. Some of them are not permitted to leave their cells, and those that are only do so under heavy guard. There are no common areas, there's no yard, and every inch of the place is under heavy surveillance. The whole basement complex is surrounded by 20 feet of reinforced concrete and runs deep beneath the prison itself. Digging your way out simply isn't an option. There's only one elevator that goes down into the basement complex of ASP, and it only moves if you've got a valid passcode and keycard. On top of that, the elevator is monitored on both ends. If anything goes wrong, the elevator gets shut down. Nobody enters that complex, and nobody leaves. You may wonder what requires that much security. You might think that whatever's down there can't be human. And you'd be right. I can't tell you much about the organization I work for, but they refer to themselves as the International Fae Relations Bureau, or FRB for short. I legitimately do not know the overall scope of their work. They're good about keeping things quiet, but what I do know is that they deal with the supernatural. Monsters, demons, fae, gods. It all falls under their umbrella. And ASP is where they keep the ones who prove to be problematic. Most of the unusual things in this world are content to keep to themselves. My understanding is that there are far fewer of them than there are of us, and most of my colleagues and I agree that they're certainly on the decline. It's why the FRB is eager to study them, especially those they have in captivity, and that's where I come in. I'll admit it. I took the prison job to satisfy my own curiosities. Despite my position as a consultant with the FRB, I'd still had only fairly limited experience with the supernatural. aside from a few strange people I'd sometimes run into at their southwestern branch, who most likely weren't entirely human. I'd never seen any of the things we'd researched firsthand. The closest I'd ever really come was when my dad passed away, and even then, I never got a good look at whatever it was that killed him. I only knew that it wasn't human, and that it wasn't an animal. That was what brought me to the FRB. And ultimately, what led me to ASP. I'd been reading about these things for years. I'd seen footage that most people would never get the chance to see. But I'd never actually laid eyes on anything truly supernatural. This job was my chance. Not only to get my hands in the dirt and interact with them, but I'd be learning about them too. Maybe I could even find ways to keep people safe from them. You can't imagine how exciting of an opportunity it was. It really did feel almost like something out of a dream. I'm sure that on my first day working at ASP, I was the only person walking into that dreary place with a legitimate smile on my face. I was met at the door by a tall and heavy-set man with kind eyes. He had a warm but tiny smile that seemed just a little out of place, given everything I knew about Ashurst.
Dr. Barry,
he said, obviously recognizing me as he went in for a handshake.
welcome to Ashurst. It's nice to finally meet you. The name's Bob Hitch. The warden asked me to meet you here.
It's nice to be here, I replied, trying to match his smile. He had an absolutely crushing handshake that didn't last for long.
Well, I'm glad you think so. This wasn't an easy position to fill.
Ashurst doesn't exactly have the greatest reputation in the first place.
I'm sure you can imagine why.
I've heard some rumors, I said as he led me inside. Bob flashed his keycard to one of the guards in the front entrance, who gave him a nod. He turned down a sterile hallway, lit with fluorescent lights, and I followed him closely.
A lot of them are true, he said. We don't typically deal with Gen Pop, but you'll still see and hear things. Part of the job, I'm afraid.
It can't be as bad as the inmates we're dealing with downstairs, I replied, half joking. Bob didn't seem amused.
You'd be surprised and disappointed to know just how similar the two are,
he replied. Up ahead was a barred metal door that we stopped in front of. Bob looked up at a security camera in the corner of the ceiling and flashed a weary smile before a buzzer sounded and the door opened. We walked past a security booth where Bob stopped to show his ID to the guard there.
Morning, Mikey. We've got some new blood with us today.
The stone-faced man in the booth glanced at me before scanning Bob's ID. He didn't respond to Bob's comment before he buzzed us through another door that led to a steel elevator door.
I assume you've been briefed on our security protocols here, correct?
He asked as we approached the elevator. He scanned a different key card to summon it. I was, yes. The key cards, the concrete, the surveillance.
Good. Saves me that part of the tour.
He gestured for me to step into the elevator and pressed his thumb against a pad to be scanned before we descended. The ride down felt longer than it should have, but maybe it was just my nerves.
You'll be joining our research team, working under Dr. Jason Hendricks. He's all right. For the most part, they observe the behavior of our inmates, although on occasion you'll be asked to interview some of the more talkative ones. Under supervision, of course. Some of the shit we've got down here is a whole new level of dangerous. Best not to take any chances.
Of course, I said, and I paused a moment before asking, how long since you've had a major incident?
Like an escape? Never. We've had a few attempts, and we've had to put down a few of the more determined ones, but that's it. Our warden has one hell of a record when it comes to safety. She takes a lot of pride in that.
She?
Elizabeth Parker, yes. She's been running this place for almost 40 years. I think she's been the one in charge ever since they opened it up. It might be best to let you know up front that she's not entirely human. Vampire. You know how it is. Wait. So the warden is an actual vampire? I asked, a little surprised. That hadn't been mentioned in the brief I'd gotten. Yeah, that she is. I figure the FRB thought it might look better to have someone who wasn't fully human running the show down here. It's probably for the best. A lot of our staff are also either fae or empowered beings. Werewolves, vampires, mediums. Best to fight fire with fire, right? So, what are you? I asked, almost a little cautiously. I'm the head of the research division. Right. Got it. I said with a nod before the elevator doors opened. I was greeted by the sight of another sterile hallway, although this one seemed a lot busier. Bob checked us in at a security checkpoint in front of the elevator door, before a final barred door opened to allow us into the hallway itself. Welcome to the basement, Dr. Barry, Bob said as we stepped through. Let me introduce you to the team. My first few weeks at ASP went about as well as I'd hoped they would. There was a slight adjustment period, to be sure, having never seen any actual fae or supernatural beings before. It was hard to figure out who was what. Just about everyone passed for a normal human at a glance, but in time, I did start to pick up on the subtleties that set them apart. Most of the guards were werewolves. You could usually tell by how chummy they were with everyone. I would have thought they'd have some sort of pack mentality, but if anything, they were just high energy and sociable. It turns out that werewolves are actually just really nice people. And that is not a sentence I ever thought I'd get to say. A lot of my coworkers on the research side ended up being vampires. They were a little easier to pick out, namely because the stereotypes are mostly true. They were pale, usually quiet, and kept to themselves. I never saw any of them eat either, although I also never saw any of them bite anyone. I still don't actually know how they feed, and I don't really want to ask. The fae and mediums were harder to pick out. Sometimes I'd catch a coworker moving something without touching it, or I'd see something a little strange and that would give it away. But without that, it was never obvious. Even if I couldn't figure out with perfect accuracy just who was what, it didn't make the overall experience any less exciting. For the first time in my life, I saw the creatures I'd been researching for years up close, and it was both breathtaking and disturbing. I'm not at liberty to share most of it, and what I could share would fill up pages and pages. There was so much, and it was beautiful. It was everything I'd ever wanted, and I suppose I really should have known better. Maybe then I wouldn't have been stupid enough to try and talk to Vikram. I suppose it's an inherent flaw of humans to want to categorize things into neat little boxes, isn't it? Maybe it's just some doomed desire to understand that which we cannot comprehend. Either way, the FRB is just as guilty of that little sin as the rest of humanity is. They categorize entities into 5, technically 6, classes. Class 1 entities aren't dangerous. They're either small enough to pose no danger or outright benevolent. Things like mediums and most ghosts, for instance. Class 2 entities are actually dangerous, but only incidentally. Things like some of the more predatory fae or ghouls. Sure, they can kill you, and some of them might just do it because they can, but they aren't outright looking to hurt anyone. Class 3 entities are dangerous on a larger scale. Things like more powerful forms of fae and whatnot. Generally, the FRB had to put them down when they encountered them, although a few still ended up in containment. A lot of what was held at that prison were either these or Class 2s. Class 4 is where it gets interesting. These are the things that could probably wipe out humanity if they were left to their own devices. I could only think of a couple of Class 4s who were held in ASP. And even then, they were held under the strictest of containment protocols. Then, last but not least came the Class 5s. Class 5 is reserved for the things that would flat out destroy the world as we know it if given the chance. 9 times out of 10, these were gods. I'd only heard rumors of Class 5 entities and never actually encountered one. I doubt I'd ever come close to doing so at ASP either. How exactly does one build a prison for a god? Technically, there's also a Class 6, but that's reserved for only 4 known entities who are quite literally the greater gods that hold reality together. I won't get into those. If you can't imprison a Class 5, you're not going to do shit against a Class 6, so why bother even talking about it, right? Anyways, Vikram was a Class 4 entity. He was what most people call an old fae, an ancient, corrupted dryad with quite a lot of power. From what I've read about the old fae, they're technically just a few steps down from being gods, and each can be contacted in their own special way. For the weaker ones, you just need to make your way through the woods and follow the right path. But for the more powerful ones, well, let's just say it gets complicated. Human sacrifice levels of complicated. Most old fae are considered Class 3 at worst, but Vikram was a special exception. As old fae went, he was one of the more powerful ones. If I recall correctly, performing his ritual had involved carving an ocarina out of the skull of an infant and playing it in a special clearing. He was brought into captivity after dragging a small town into whatever weird dimension the old fae typically hide in, and keeping them there for a few centuries just for shits and giggles. Since the FRB had no idea on how to kill an old fae, they'd opted to contain him. I guess it wasn't all bad. Supposedly, Vikram could have answered a lot of lingering questions we had about dryads and the old fae if he'd wanted to. But that was sort of where the problem started. He didn't want to. I first saw old Vikram about 3 weeks after starting at the ASP. Dr. Hendricks had put me on a team to analyze the footage from his cell. The whole point had been to take notes on his reactions to certain substances he'd been exposed to. I suppose the whole idea had been to see if anything we tried could actually hurt him, but neither Dr. Hendricks or any of my coworkers ever said that out loud. I remember the first time I saw him on a recording. My team and I had set up a television in a quiet boardroom. The week before, a small team of guards had attempted maintenance on old Vikram's cell using a solution of vinegar and salt water. I'm not sure where they'd come up with the idea, but I suppose it was worth a shot. The footage we were shown depicted a few men in hazmat suits entering the cell through the airlock. Old Vikram himself wasn't even visible on the screen. Someone else had told me before that he didn't like being seen, but even if he wasn't visible, there was evidence that he was there all right. You could see the dense foliage growing from the back of his cell toward the airlock. Spreading plant life is something that dryads just sort of do, and the old fae are no exception. I watched as the men in suits sprayed down his foliage before they retreated out the airlock unmolested. I'll admit, given everything I'd heard about things like old Vikram, I hadn't expected him to just let them leave. But I suppose this was a more controlled situation than what one might find out in the wild. From there, we watched to see if the vinegar solution had any effect. Boring stuff, really. I wish I could say that it wasn't a complete waste of time, but it absolutely was. Salt and vinegar, various types of weed killer, new variations they developed. None of it worked. Even if it normally should have killed the plant life in there, it didn't do jack shit as long as he was in there. Old Vikram was content to ignore them, and they kept away from the back of his cell where he was hidden amongst the foliage. His camouflage was damn good, too. Looking straight into his cell, it was impossible to see him. The only way we knew he was even still in there was because of some of the readings from inside the cell, confirming that something was definitely alive in there. I remember it was after about a week of watching the security team waste their time and hours that I finally asked Hendrix the million-dollar question that had crossed my mind. You guys ever think to just interview the big guy? We'd been receiving one of the last rounds of testing that had utilized a variant of Agent Orange that some idiot had modified to be even more dangerous, and I'll admit that my question mainly came from a place of frustration. What? Old Vikram? Hendrix asked, looking over at me. He scoffed. Old Fae like him aren't known to be all that talkative, unless you've got something to offer 'em. So, what have we got to offer him then? It's not a question of we. It would probably depend on who's doing the interviewing. Old Fae always want something personal, something of value, and not always something tangible. They might take years off your lifespan, or memories of the people you love most. Dealing with them is risky. Interviewing him could end very badly. I take it that nobody's volunteered then? I asked. Nobody's that stupid, Barry. Maybe I shouldn't have taken that as a challenge. Not to speak out of turn, but we're not exactly getting very far by watching the guards spray him with chemicals. I don't know. Maybe it's time to try a different approach. I mean, if at first you don't succeed, sometimes you just redefine success. Hendrix raised an eyebrow. And you think trying to talk to him is going to yield results? Well, it can't hurt to try. I'll do it myself if I have to. Consider me your first volunteer. I knew that Hendrix wasn't taking me completely seriously, but I was about as serious as a heart attack. All right, then, he finally said. Tell you what, I'll have a word with Warden Parker, see if I can't get her to sign off on this, and then we'll talk about getting you in there.
Ooh, as the story thickens. There is very good stories tonight. Normally I'd only have a story on Friday, but sorry, on a Saturday. Oh, on a Friday. Why even say Friday? On a Saturday. But as hopefully you can now see that this is a tooth fairy. Not the floaty around, colourful, spangly, dusty. Oh, look at me! I'm a fun, I'm a lovely fairy. Fairies. This is a actual tooth fairy, one that likes the taste of your teeth. And yeah, we've been listening to some gruesome stories, and hopefully you have enjoyed them. If you would like to find out more about them, you need to go to the Lighthouse Horror. Subscribe to their YouTube channel. I've just subscribed because I'm going to be listening to some more of those stories. But like I said, today is all about illustration, and Inktober, day 24, and the word was fairy. I've done a tooth fairy, like I said, and not a nice fairy at all. It's going to be coming for your teeth, and it wants to eat them for themselves, or wants them back, is the original story we started off with. But yeah, guys, hopefully you have enjoyed today's illustration. I thoroughly enjoyed drawing this one. Again, I have trained myself to do some freehand sketching, and I don't know about you, but I think I'm getting a little bit better. If you agree, don't forget to leave a thumbs up. If you're new, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button, ding the bell for notifications, because you know I'll be back again tomorrow for another illustration. It may not be as late as tonight. It may be during the day. You don't know until the pop-up comes up, because I'm kind of if and with where I do these, what time I can do them. But otherwise, guys, hopefully you have enjoyed it once again, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Good night.